What's up, sluts? This bitch is 21st and it's on 5786, Wednesday, April 8th. We've been doing this bullshit for 103 days. (3761) Creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava. 3631, 30 Seth, son of Adam, was born. 3526, 235 Enosh, son of Seth, was born. Great fucking story right now. Now what? Now I have like 1,000 streams I have to start. Sucks. What the fuck is going on with this bullshit? Really? Yeah. Are you okay though? Stay the course, baby. 1,000 points of light. 1,000 points of light. Really? Who the fuck knows? What does that even mean? George Herbert Walker Bush. What does 1,000 points of light even mean? Are you done? Supervision of America.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore history, philosophy, and religion.
Oh, we didn't do the thing.
And starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah.
Blessed you, Hashem, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the coming of the Omer. Today is 7 days, which is 1 week of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. Selah.
For deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to the congregation for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics in esoteric hermetic philosophy, perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. So, as we talked about last time, the Sefer is a kind of brush composed of a bunch of uneven sections that has become the core of the Kabbalah. In fact, it is now the core of the Kabbalah. It's the most recently added scripture of Judaism after the Talmud. The Talmud and the Midrash literature is a kind of scripture, and the Zohar has now become a kind of scripture as well, depending on the community, especially in the Orthodox world, less so in the liberal world. It's composed by Moshe de Leon, and circle around him sometime in the late 13th century, although it's traditionally ascribed to Shimon Bar Yochai, who's a 2nd century sage. And some of the core concepts we talked about last time are Shekhinah. This is the idea that God has a feminine aspect. And that Shekhinah, that feminine aspect of God, dwells in our world. That is how we experience God, through God's feminine aspect. And part of what's going on in the Kabbalistic drama, in the Kabbalistic theory, is that the goal in some level of Kabbalah is a kind of sacred marriage between Israel, the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah in Israel, and the upper Sephirot. We'll talk about how that's accomplished in just a second. And as you may remember last time too, when we talked about the concept of evil in the Zohar, unlike the previous, more philosophical theories of evil, in which evil was simply a privation. You can think of cold being the absence of hot, or darkness being the absence of light. The Zohar rejects that theory and says no, evil is very real. It's actually part of the dross. It's an afterbirth in terms of how reality is created. In that afterbirth comes, or that dross is thrown off by Gevurah, God's judgment, or God's justice. It's Gevurah overcome in such a way that Chesed doesn't check it, and when Chesed or mercy and love doesn't check Gevurah, that overflow of judgment becomes evil. And that forms a different dimension of reality called Sitra Achra, the other side. And that other side is where the opposite of God lives. This is the realm of the demonic. And the Zohar is very, very, very concerned about the realm of the demonic. And it has, in fact, very complex, a couple of different complex, very demonological systems. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into all those demonological systems, but we could in another, maybe if we do a whole Zohar class, we can get into Zoharic demonology. As I mentioned also, right, the Zohar is hyper-literal. It likes to take things very, very, very seriously. Remember I said that one of the things is the Zohar likes to read into the Bible is anywhere the direct object marker, et, occurs in Hebrew. I think someone pointed out in the chat last time that it occurs everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. It does. Everywhere there is a direct object in the sentence, the word et appears in Hebrew. And so people said, yeah, the Shekhinah must be everywhere. And that's what et means according to the Zohar. Anytime there's an et, that means the Shekhinah is there. And people said, well, that means the Shekhinah is everywhere. Of course Shekhinah is everywhere. Because God is everywhere. And God only appears as Shekhinah in our realm according to the Zohar. Now, how do we deal with this hyperliteralism? And well, we deal with it with a kind of hyper-conservatism when it comes to Jew. And that takes the form that Torah is very, very literal about the doing of Jewish law. It does not interpret the Jewish law metaphorically. It says that if the Torah tells you to put the felon on every day, you do it. And not only do you do it, that is the key to seducing Shekhinah. and I didn't talk about this much last time, and I should have, it was a mistake of mine, that the Zohar likes to describe the commandments, the following of the commandments, as something like foreplay or seducing God. And as we seduce God by following the commandments, we become married to God through sin. Become married to God through like kind of marriage. And that marriage to God is exactly what's supposed to happen to redeem the world. That is to say, now the masculine, the feminine, all these things are balanced, and is the metaphysical ideal that the Zohar aims for. And so the following of the law is not just a optional thing in the Zohar. The following of the Jewish law, Shabbat, laying tefillin, keeping the Shabbat, separating meat and milk, all the things, all the 613 rules that you know and love, not just rules to follow, they are the roadmap by which one Israel seduces God into the sacred marriage. And in that sacred marriage, the cosmos is repaired. And that reparation of the cosmos is the goal of the Kabbalah as it's understood by the Zohar. And so there is no Kabbalah for the writer of the Zohar without scrupulous halakhic attention to the Jewish law. And that's one thing I want to drive home. I'm not trying to say that non-Jewish people can't appreciate Kabbalah, that non-Jewish people can't learn from Kabbalah. I'm saying that the writer of the Zohar does not imagine that there, not just outside of Judaism, that's not even imaginable. There's no Kabbalah outside of a strict Orthodox Judaism. And so the idea of tikkun olam is helping the world, repairing the world by giving charity and doing activism. The writer of the Zohar would say, sure, but you got to do the other stuff too. It's not enough to give to charity and help make the world better materially. You have to very carefully keep the law. You have to make sure that you don't wear clothes that have linen and wool blended together in shackles, because that destroys the universe. That destroys the cosmos when you do that. You have to make sure to accept it. And by observing that, you help to balance the world. So it's a very legalistic mysticism. And I know that the phrase legalistic mysticism sounds bizarre to us because we think of mysticism as kind of pervasive. It's just feeling and emotion. It's just experience. But that's not true for Kabbalah. It's about obedience and transcendence. It's about immanence and transcendence. And you have to balance both, of course, with the Zohar. So now, again, I'm not trying to gatekeep here and say that non-Jews can't appreciate Kabbalah. I'm just what the Zohar says. Does that mean you have to accept what the Zohar says? Do what the hell you want. It's your business. I'm just telling you, don't let anyone tell you that it's kumbaya in the Zohar, because that's just not true. Now, does that mean that you have to be bound to that? No. But I don't want to lie to you. I'm going to tell you some hippy-dippy kumbaya Zohar. I'm just going to be honest about what it says. Now, what it says and what to do with it are two different questions. And what to do with it is a question that you have to do with it. That's your business. All I'm here to, what I have to do responsibly from my end is tell you what it says and how it works. And from there, you do you as the say. Let's jump in, folks. Let's jump in. So, the main thing I want to drive home tonight is that when we tell the story of the Zohar, sometimes we tell the story of philosophy, that there was a bunch of Greek people and a bunch of medieval people, and then Descartes happened, and nothing happened in between. It's as if there were a bunch of Greek people and there were a bunch of medieval people, and then Descartes happened, and it happened in the middle of all that. Sometimes we do the same mistake when it comes to the Zohar or the Kabbalah. We pretend that the Zohar got written, and then Isaac Luria came, and then everything was done. And the Kabbalah was not there before that, right? And that story is just incorrect. To know is that the appearance of the Zohar beginning 1790s and then through the 14th century, it didn't make huge waves. It wasn't a big deal. Many people did not buy into it. It wasn't widely disseminated, and many people didn't know about it. It slowly began to percolate through Europe, and then eventually Italy, eventually to the East, and then Morocco, of course, as well. What's important to know is that it just didn't make it wasn't a big splash at first. It was mostly the purview of a very tiny group of people who did not make it public. And can you blame them? We just talked about all kinds of weird stuff that Zohar teaches. Do you want to be the guy that gets the first couple pages of goes to your local rabbi and tells him that you believe this? No. You're going to sound like a crazy person. The Zohar sounds crazy now. Do you really want to be the person to go and be like, yeah, preach it from the mountaintop. Let's talk about Zohar in 1310 in a village in Germany. People are like, you mean that we have to get married to God? What are you talking about? They're going to think you're a crazy heretic. And so what ends up happening is the parcel out in sections and sent all around. People are carrying chunks of it, but no one's really going to publicize it. People are still playing the cards pretty close to their chest. Because again, this is a pretty dangerous time to be a heretic. You do not heretic Jew. You don't. That's a death sentence in many ways. And so the Zohar and Kabbalah are still close to the chest. Also around this time, it's not like the Zohar ended with the Zohar. Now that's a weird thing to say, but what ends up happening is that after the Zohar as we have it is kind of done, there are Zoharic-like documents that get produced after the Zohar, the most famous of which is a document called the Tikkunei Zohar, another is the Ra'aya Mehimna, and these two documents are actually probably produced in the people that produced the Zohar, but they're not quite the same. But they're so associated with the Zohar that they're kind of Zohar-like. So much so that in the modern version of the Zohar, they're attached to the Zohar. They're kind of like an appendix, like an apocrypha. They're kind of like Zohar apocryphas. That's maybe not quite true, but they're put there, and they're not quite the same as the Zohar. Although I will say that in the modern Daniel Matt edition, that is to say the 12-volume massive Daniel Matt edition that's out now, he does not translate Ra'aya Mehimna. Although Tikkunei Zohar and Ra'aya Mehimna in many ways were more popular because they're more coherent than the actual Zohar itself was. These are kind of like digests of Zoharic material. So we also have the Zohar has a kind of half-life. So we have the main Zohar, like the Zohar, and it sort of continues to exist in a strange way for a couple decades after completed as much as it was. We don't even know how it was dissimulated. There's a great book by Boaz Moose that I have back here about, it's a study of just what we know about how the Zohar actually got published and how it got disseminated out. And what we now think is that it was never disseminated out in one complete text. It was always parceled out into chunks, and those chunks kind of moved around. And one of the things the printers had to do with the Zohar was collect all those chunks and then organize them into one text and then print that. So it was a mess, but also just a mess of a text, even in terms of its dissemination. One of the texts that we do know of, however, that was incredibly popular was a very small section of the Zohar called the Sifra Tzniuta, which is without a doubt the most complicated and bizarre section. It's only about 10 pages of the Zohar if you read it in Aramaic, but it's the most enigmatic section of the entire text. For whatever reason, this was really, and that's a text that really traveled far and wide. It's an incredibly difficult to understand section. I've probably read it a dozen times, but I can tell you that even trying to summarize it right now, it would be fits and starts. It's so weird. So we do know that some sections of the Zohar proved very popular early on, and some sections didn't. So it wasn't even like it was received clearly in one kind of way. What we think happened was that the Zohar was kind of sent out in digests, and people in various communities found certain parts interesting and certain parts not, and it was kind of spread out like this. In the generation after the publication of the Zohar, we basically have three major things that begin to happen. The first major thing that begins to happen in the aftermath of the publication of the Zohar, which everyone viewed was important. Everyone realized it was an important document. It's substantial, right? I mean, think about the documents we've talked about so far in this class. They're 30, 40 pages long. This is 1,700 pages. This is a monumental text. So regardless of what you thought about it, it was important. It wasn't just a 200-page, 100-page Sefer Bahir. This was a monuments of literature. The first of it was, what does this text even mean? Remember, this text isn't even written in standard Hebrew. It's written in an obscure dialect of Aramaic, so obscure that you basically have to learn it just to read it. It's not even in a standard Babylonian Aramaic. It's an idiolect of Palestinian Aramaic. It's a very, very strange language. So just to try to figure out what it meant took about a generation. Secondly, many people did not buy it. There were many Jews that thought this doctrine, and it's dangerous. It's full of heretical, nonsense ideas, and it's going to get people to become pagans. And so we have, for instance, a very famous story of Itzhak of Akko, and he saw parts of the Zohar at Palestine, and it reached him in Palestine. And if it's by Shimon Bar Yochai, I want to understand for sure. So what did he do? He went all the way to Spain to try to. He went all the way back to Spain. He made it to Guadalajara. He made it to Leon. And he made it to Moshe Leon's wife. And Moshe Leon's wife ratted him out. She said he made it up from his own. It came from intelligence. Isaac said, "You mean to tell me he did not have any ancient manuscripts?" And she was like, "No, he made it up." Now, what does make it up mean? Well, it might mean he was a fraud. It might also mean, according to other interpretations, that he had a kind of mystical insight. And his mystical insight allowed him to kind of channel the Zohar, the same way that Joseph Smith channeled the Book of Mormon. That's a claim that people have made, right? The Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith never claimed he actually translated from gold plates. Joseph Smith claimed he used stones, looked into a hat, and translated it spiritually. Well, maybe it's something, Moses of Leon did something similar to Zohar. So there were people actively trying to do investigative work to figure out whether this thing was real, right? Now, what's weird about Isaac of Akko is that eventually, toward the end of his life, he accepted the Zohar as legitimate, despite what Moses of Leon's wife told him. He accepted it as legitimate. Now, legitimate, what does that mean? It's a big question. But he did ultimately come to accept it, but many people did not. Once you can read the damn thing, well, how do you systematize it? What do these Sephiroth mean? How do you understand all these different connections? How do you understand the 10 Sephiroth track the various matriarchs and patriarchs and are in these weird relationships, and they have all these complicated things that they're doing? Systematize this thing into a way of being Jewish. You can't just let it be a bunch of weird stuff. If it's the case, as Zohar is telling you that the entire purpose of this is the redemption of the world, the bringing forth of the Messianic age, you got to figure out how to do it. And the only way to figure out how to do it is to systemize the text such that you can understand what's happening. If you need to balance out 10 things, you know what 10 things are, and how the 10 things relate, and how the mitzvot relate to those 10 things. So you can do the work of mystically aligning it. So you're going to need people like encyclopedists. You're going to need people like systematizers. And that will be an entire generation, several generations of people that are going to be doing that work of systematizing things. And the first of those great systematizers, right, is people like Abraham Gigatia. So Abraham Gigatia is a person living in Spain. Here is his name. And he lived roughly right around the same time period, toward the end of the composition of the Zohar. And there are some folks earlier than him as well that are worth mentioning here. I'm just going to those folks do. But Joseph Gigatia is probably either one of the earliest people to receive it in the circle of people composing it, but his work, Sha'ar, the Gates of Light, is the earliest attempt to formally systematize the structure of a Sefer. So he's early on, right? So again, if you think about this, the Sefer Zohar being written in the 1280s, 1290s, 1270s, you can see he's right in that time in Spain. So he receives the Zohar, and he's one of the earliest systematizers. And his book Sha'arei Ora is one of the earliest attempts to systematize it. And also, this is one of the earliest books of Hebrew into Latin to give access of the Kabbalah to Christians. In fact, if you've ever seen this image, that the front edition by Rikius of Joseph Diaz Sha'arei Ora. You can see it translated here as the gates of light, Sha'arei Ora, right? So here we have it. And look, the earliest depiction of the sphere. You can see it, Keter, right? So this is a very early depiction, right? And this is supposed to be Shimon Bar Yochai, right? Holding up so this is an early habit. Some folks have seen this picture before, and you have been following such. Yeah. So that's going to be really very important process. Another really important early Kabbalistic document that's going to be important here is going to be Menachem Rekanti's commentary on the Zohar. And Rekanti's commentary on the Zohar will be what's going to be part of legitimating the Zohar, because Rekanti is one of the great scholars of this. And he's also going to do the part of sort of transmitting Zoharic ideas in Italy. Right, so we have an Italian learning Kabbalah, translating some of those ideas into Italy. Man, this is going to be once they get to Italy, they can spread everywhere, because Italy obviously is the hub, and so they can get anywhere in the world at that point once they reach Italy. Also, things are making their way over to Morocco. This is also very important. Morocco is going to be an incredibly important spot for the development of Kabbalah, and we're just in the infancy of figuring out how that worked, how things got to Morocco. There was a huge Jewish community in Fez, and there was until the 20th century, basically. And so Moroccan Kabbalah is going to be its own branch of Kabbalah. It's one of the things I would love to see an entire book about. It's just the movement of Kabbalah to Morocco and the development of Moroccan Kabbalah. In many ways, like many Kabbalah is a distinct form of Kabbalah, but the studies on that stuff is very primitive right now. Very primitive. And you can imagine why. The archives are very difficult to access, and you have to be able to read medieval manuscripts in 4 languages. It's tough. You basically have to be trained to do that job, and not many people are. Not many people. One of the spots that future scholarship is going to make us a lot more wise. Also, by the way, it's also going to decentralize Europe in a lot of ways, because so much of what's going to happen is going to be in Morocco, Iraq. We talk so much about Europe, but we need to be very clear about this. European Kabbalah is one part of the story, and the reason why we know that part of the story so well is because a lot of Europeans have done that work before. Do not be fooled that Kabbalah is a European-centric phenomenon. Do not let that be fooled. We just don't know about the rest, because we haven't done the work yet, because we don't have people do the work yet, or we haven't prioritized it. What's also important to know about the development of Kabbalah and what, again, I call the interregnum period between the writing of the composition of the Zohar and the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah is that there were other Kabbalahs around. It wasn't like the Zohar was going to win. The Zohar was one weird document that was out there. People were interested in it, but it wasn't like it was going to be the only thing. At the same time that the Zohar, the version of the Kabbalah that dominated by the Zohar, is sometimes called Theosophical Kabbalah. There was an intellectual form of Kabbalah actually was much closer to philosophy. Remember that the Zohar has a very kind of philosophy kind of bent, a little bit. There were other forms of Kabbalah that were developing. Remember, Kabbalah was developing in Spain, France, and other places. And there's another form of Kabbalah that's much more cozy with philosophy. In fact, they want to combine Maimonidean philosophy, Sefer Yetzirah. They want to combine philosophy, all what's great about Kabbalah, into one system. They don't want to kick Kabbalah. They want to kick philosophy to the road. They want to actually blend them together. There are forms of Kabbalah that develop, like I said, in Morocco and also in Spain, that are much more cozy with rationalism, with the intellect, with Maimonides even. And these forms of intellectual Kabbalah are completely distinct from what's going on in the realm of the Zohar. Now, you don't hear a lot about these. The Zohar is going to win, right? But these other forms of Kabbalah are just as legitimate, just worth studying. Now, what ends up happening in these forms of Kabbalah is that the Sphira is there. Right? These forms of Kabbalah accept the Sefer Yetzirah. They accept the Eden circle at some level. They say God. They're parts of our intellect. They're parts of God that actually are part of our intellect, that are the image of God. And so they're not metaphysical objects that are worthy of speculation out there. Right? The ladder is not from me to up there. The ladder is from in here to God. The ladder is in here. It's in the intellect. And you climb it in here. In your mind. In the intellect. Not ontologically out there. It's all in here. Not up. In this form of Kabbalah, the intellect is central. And what you do is that you go inside of your mind and through a process of meditation, through a process of breathing techniques, through a process of writing out words and meditating on language, you begin to clear the mind. And as you begin to clear the mind of the nonsense, you begin to un-God. And then you begin to climb up the Sphirot in your mind by uncovering the structures of the mind, the pure mind. And that pure mind is on you from God. And by climbing up the ladder of the intellect, your intellect becomes united with God. Notice this is a very Kabbalah. It has everything to do with meditating, to do with contemplation, as opposed to following Jewish law. It's a very now you can't not follow Jewish law. That's important. This is a very different time. The apex of this formula we often call ecstatic Kabbalah. Ecstasis means go out of yourself. We'll see what this means in a second. Or we call it prophetic Kabbalah. And the most important example of this is, of course, Abraham Abalafi. Right? Abraham Abalafi, another Spaniard, right? Born in Spain. Again, this is a thing where any Ashkenazi person should be very thankful for all the kind, smart people given us Kabbalah. Abraham Abalafi was born around 1240, died around 1291, so born right around the time of the rise, contemporary with the rise of the Zohar. But from his writings, we can't tell that he knows anything about it. At the time it was being written, but there's no evidence he knew anything about it, basically. He roamed around. Where most of us locked down, she'll have to be able to travel around like Afia. In fact, he traveled as far as Iraq and Iran, and he's trying to find a mystical river called the Sambation. There's an idea that there's a mystical river called the Sambation beyond the 10 lost tribes of Israel gathered. And if you can find the river and go across, then you can begin the process of leaving the world and bringing the Messiah. Very early on, messy scheme, one might call it, but the world was cast into chaos. If you look at the time period, right, 1240 to 1290, we're looking at the high point of the Crusades. So that wasn't a good time to be in that region. And so eventually he turns back. Abalafi, aside from the Bible in many ways, and the Talmud had one text that he felt was very dear to him, and that was Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. Now, most of us do not associate mysticism with Maimonides. Most of us do not associate mysticism with the Guide to the Perplexed. If you ask most people what is the most mystical text in the history of Judaism, they're going to tell you it's the Guide to the Perplexed. Abalafi would tell you the truth. It's hard. So around the age of 31, he returns to Spain after traveling a long time, and he begins to have these what we call prophetic or ecstatic experiences. And this was brought on by some degree of mixing magical techniques that he probably adopted from the world of the Ashkenazis, the Ashkenaz, and also some techniques that he's been developing from the Sefer Yetzirah. And what he ends up developing is a very complex system of breathing techniques, of letter combination techniques, of meditation techniques, and even body techniques. And many of these we think are being picked up from Sufism. Again, we're talking about him traveling in the Islamic world, and he's probably picking up some Sufi techniques. If you've ever seen the whirling dervishes and people like them, are into trances by body, breathing, and spinning. Very likely that Abulafi is speaking of some of those kinds of techniques as well. And what ends up happening is Abulafi develops a prophetic form of Kabbalah. Now, this prophetic form of Kabbalah, of which we have about a half a dozen books that he's written, and the earliest of which is a text called Sefer HaYashar, right? And these mystical insights that he gets, we'll talk more about how he achieves them in just a minute. These mystical insights that he gets eventually convince him that he is, the Messiah. Which is always, as you probably know from history, the most dangerous thing you can believe. You'll be dead in no time. So he believes he's the Messiah, and of course, what he does is he does what any rational person does. He goes to Rome to tell the Pope that he's going to convert him to Judaism and begin the process of the redemption of the world. Well, the Pope basically orders him to be arrested and killed, and Abulafi is great luck, it's stroke or something, he died. And Abulafi is, I think, briefly arrested by the Dominicans or some such, and he's released. I don't know how he got that lucky, but you know, and this happens, by the way, to several people in history. They challenge the Pope to do this, that, whatever, and they get themselves killed, and the Pope dies. So, again, not to hope anyone dies, much less the Pope, but I'm glad that Abraham Abulafi did not get to show down with the Pope. So my router crashed. Too many tabs open here. The curse of the academic. Is there any more with Abulafi? Yeah. And Abulafi is a good job. Abulafi. He would spend the rest of his career basically traveling around, writing books, lecturing on the fact perplexed, and basically saying that he was the Messiah. And originally, toward the end of his life, some pretty important Jewish folk in the area of Sicily ultimately had him condemned by another Kabbalist, right? Shlomo was a pretty famous Kabbalist at the time. He was at least friendly with Kabbalah, and he had him basically exiled, and he disappears from history in about 1291. So what ends up happening is Abulafi vanishes. We don't know what happened to him. He died or disappeared or become occulted. He'll come back later and save us all. I don't know. Abulafi produced enormous amounts of works. Prophetic works, commentaries, Moses' most of Maimonides has got reflects and Sefer Yetzirah. Works now comprise about 13 modern volumes. I have the complete works of Abulafi downstairs in Hebrew. It's about 13 volumes, although they're not terribly reliable. A critical edition of Maimonides' works is still something we need. It's still not there yet. And so Maimonides is one of these critically important mystics that we just don't have a complete works for in Hebrew, even in English, really, which is a disaster in I think a lot of ways, but maybe one day in our lifetime we'll have it. What makes Abulafi's work so important is that not only does he do philosophical speculation, he tells you the breathing techniques, he tells you the letter techniques, he tells you how to do the combinations, he tells you they are guidebooks, and those parts of the books rarely ever got printed because people were terrified of trying this stuff, because Abulafi did this stuff and thought he was the Messiah, and people did not want that happening, and so these sections of these books are hardly ever even reproduced in Hebrew. I do have them in Hebrew, and they're super complicated. It's all about combining letter values and stuff like that. There was a scholar named Moshe Yiddel, one of the most important scholars of Kabbalah these days. Moshe Yiddel did work with a neuroscientist to reproduce some of Abraham Abulafi's breathing and meditation techniques, and it showed on the neurological level, it showed results. It was changing people's brains, right? So there is something to it. In the same way we studied Zen nuns who chant, so there is something to it. Not right, and this is to get a little bit of influence of medieval philosophy, which I'm not going to do because I don't want to be correct. But get coming from Aristotle that your intellect, right? So think about a bunch of dominoes. Imagine the universe with a bunch of dominoes. No domino can fall on its own. Some domino needs to knock the other dominoes down. And each domino has to be knocked over by another domino. So every domino is passive until another domino acts on it and knocks it down. And then that domino knocks it, and it becomes the new active domino. And it knocks the other passive domino down. Active, passive, active, passive, active, passive, active. Aristotle thought that the mind worked like that too. Your mind is passive at first, and it needs something to activate it, but it can't activate itself. So what activates it? Another mind outside of it. It's like a domino clicking your mind on, or someone turning a light switch on. The light is passively on, or passively there, and we click the light, and the light shines. Well, everything outside the mind that lights the mind up. Your mind is passive, and something activates it. What's that active thing that lights up? Another mind. What mind? God's mind turns the light on in your mind, illuminates your mind. Well, often our minds are kind of full of gunk, right? I mean, think about your day. Do you really think about how your mind is a realm of God? No, you think about paying the bills and getting the kids and doing the thing and getting some food and doing whatever teaching class. Your mind's covered up with all kinds of layers of things that are created by God's mind. Well, what is the technique that Abalafi develops? A way of clearing off the gunk, so that your mind reaches all the way back up to the divine mind, and that your mind and God's mind. And when that happens, when your mind and God's mind become connected, you see like God does. You see time just as one thing. No longer in third dimensions, you're in four dimensions, and you see time. You can look that way into the past, and look that way into the future. That's prophecy. You can see how things are going to go. You can see how things went. You can see where you are. You see from a God's eye perspective. Your mind becomes connected to God's mind at some level. And Abalafi tried to develop meditation techniques and language techniques to reconnect your mind to God's mind. Now notice how this is very different than the Zohar. The Zohar is a very different animal. You are trying to think, but in a very, very different way. In fact, even Abalafi gives us phenomenal laws to let us know we're on the right path. He says when you start doing this correctly, your body will emit light. You'll see a double of yourself in front of you, like another you, your Selem, your astral body, communicating with you. And eventually you'll have a terrifying moment, and then you'll break through to pure joy. Right? And once you break through to pure joy, you're then jettisoned up to the divine mind. By the way, this sounds a lot like Zen Buddhism in a lot of ways, and many people have drawn a lot of comparisons between Zen Buddhism and Abalafi's meditation technique. This how-to aspect of Abalafi's work was always viewed with a lot of suspicion by a lot of Jews because of how Abalafi turned out, and also just because it's the idea of joining with God is a very controversial idea in Judaism because the idea that God is transcendent, you're not, so that's a weird thing. Abalafi's ideas were incredibly interesting, and eventually will get redeemed back into mainstream Kabbalah. And I would say that now Abalafi's ideas are being brought back in and synthesized at some level with someone. But you can see they're very, and I bet you can see these are fundamentally different ways. Kabbalah. But what's important about this is that what the Kabbalah was in 1350 was there were Kabbalahs. And because there were Kabbalahs, it could have gone lots of ways, but eventually it's going to go one way. We'll talk about that way. We'll talk about the way in just a second. Or so I'm talking about it now. The most important event in the history of the Kabbalah is the Alhambra decree, which, as I'm sure all of us, the decree of Spanish monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand, one of them over there in my collection. Banned all Jews from living in the area beginning in the summer of 1492. The enactment of the Alhambra Decree took effect on Tish B'Av of that year. So add injury to insult. And what ends up happening is that, like in many cases as we talked about early on in this class, when the Jews don't get running, the Jews get apocalyptic. So when bad stuff happens, apocalypticism kind of comes in and say, "Hi guys, I'm here for you." And so this apocalyptic fervor begins to emerge in Judaism again with the Alhambra Decree, and that apocalyptic fervor is combined with the Kabbalah. Now, if you can't imagine a more spicy thing than that, I don't know what you can think of. Kabbalah plus apocalypse is like, that's the means, y'all. That's the thing. And so they begin to this idea. Not only that, there's an idea that God had sent the Kabbalah to prepare the Jews for 1492 with the Alhambra Decree. The Alhambra Decree was the beginning of the end of the world, the whole damn thing, or the beginning of at least the Messianic era, and that Kabbalah was how to bring it home. So what was previously, before 1492, a very carefully guarded, secretive world of Kabbalah, after 1492, the new idea was we need to popularize this. By popularizing it, we will herald the Messiah. Kabbalah is like the rug that we lay out for the Messiah. We got to roll the rug out. How we roll the rug out? By popularizing these ideas, by intensifying our devotion to this new idea, right? Which again, to them wasn't new, right? They really believed it was ancient. And to wit, because they believed that it was ancient, because they really believed that the Zohar really all came all the way from Shimon Bar Yochai, where did they go to settle when they were exiled? Many of them were collected by Bayezid II, who also was one from. Bayezid II was the Ottoman Turk emperor, who was incredibly gracious. He sent his entire fleet to rescue Jews who were being exiled from Spain. Again, this is one of these things where we should tell the story very clearly that this is a case where Muslims saved Jews. Bayezid II recognized this as a very important thing for his empire, and he brought Jews all the way to the Ottoman Empire. By the way, in 1492, there was no printing presses in the Ottoman Empire. In 1493, there was one in Salonika set up by Jews. So Bayezid II was very, very intelligent in this regard. He knew that rescuing the Jewish population would be good for his empire. And so many Jews who came from Spain after 1492, after the Alhambra Decree, where did they go? They were Kabbalists. They first went to Jerusalem, and then where did they go? Where's home? It's Galilee, where Shimon Bar Yochai is from, the author of the Zohar. Now think about how interesting this is. This is a document written by someone that's not actually from Palestine, a Spaniard, in that you have an entire population moving to Israel, Palestine. They land in Jerusalem, and they settle in the area of their hero, Shimon Bar Yochai, Meron, and Tzfat. And if you know anything about Meron and Tzfat, you know that is now, to this day, the center of Kabbalah. They built a center where there was none prior. They built an entire world for themselves, and then lived it. It's an amazing mystical story. In the world of the Ottoman Empire, the Kabbalah is about to undergo a titanic change. So some of the earliest important systematizers of Kabbalah at this time was Meir ibn Gabbai. Meir ibn Gabbai, he wrote one of the earliest systematic accounts of Kabbalah as we have it. But the most important systematizer of Kabbalah is going to be at this time Moses ben Yaakov Cordovero. And he's going to write, published in 1548, his Pardes Romain. And this is the most encyclopedic, most coherent, and most systematic account of Zohar and Kabbalah to be produced, basically in some ways ever. And just to briefly summarize how he thinks, some of the things he thinks, He imagines the spherode as emerging from a kind of dialectic. That is to say, they always contain their opposite, and their opposite breaks off of them. Have you folks ever seen how cells undergo like mitosis? Right? Is it mitosis where cells break away from each other? All right, where they sort of, you see them like doing the thing, and right? He imagined, he wrote, that Ein Sof contained a contradiction, and that from that contradiction emerged Sphira, and then that contained all the contradictions of Ein Sof, and broke again, broke again, broke again, broke again. So what we have in the idea of Pharaoh is we actually have a reason why he developed the way he did. For him, there's an inner dynamism even inside each Sphira, and that's going to get turned up to the max because it's like Lurie next time. So he's trying to systematize why the Zohar works the way the Zohar works. Why does Sphira obey rules? What are the rules that Sphira obey? How do they work? And why are they the way that they are? So he's the great systematizer. Another major work that he has is a text called Or Yakar. Or Yakar is a commentary on all the Zohar literature. In fact, this commentary is so vast that a modern edition is still not done. There is no modern edition of the Or Yakar. They're still putting it out in Hebrew. I think it's running 24 volumes at this point. He spent decades working on it. It may be done in our lifetime. The modern edition may be done in Hebrew in our lifetime. English edition is not even on the radar. Just to get a standard Hebrew edition done. This work is so massive. It's I think been in the works since the 60s. And I think it's still not done. There are 24 volumes or something. It's massive comedy. Another work that he produced was a document called the Tomer Devorah, the Palm Tree of Devorah. This is an ethical, very tiny little book. You can read it in acronym. And this is an ethical version of Kabbalah. It's trying to understand Kabbalah as an ethical program. How to be a Kabbalistic informed Jew. And these ethical Kabbalistic books, these kind of books of Kabbalah ethics, be a Kabbalist, how to be a Kabbalistic informed Jew. In fact, many of those are responsible for popularizing a lot of Kabbalistic ideas. In fact, some people ask me, what Kabbalistic book would you read first? And I tell them, from the advice of a friend of mine, that I would say Tomer Devorah. If you want to read any Kabbalistic book first, get a copy of Tomer Devorah. Way of getting an inroad into this conversation. You can buy copies that are in Hebrew and English. So he also wrote this text, Tomer Devorah, very important ethical work of Kabbalah. Cordovero was a great systematizer of the generation. And I would say that in many ways, I'll speak for myself personally here, which I rarely do, but I will say, I prefer Cordovero's system of Kabbalah in many ways, from a philosophic point of view, more than I appreciate Yitzhak Luria's. Now, I know you're not supposed to say that because Yitzhak Luria is the bee's knees of everything all the time. I will say that Cordovero's system is much more rigorous, much more systematic, much more philosophical. So I appreciate Cordovero a great deal. Now his elder brother-in-law, right, was Shlomo Alphabetz. Now you may have never heard of Shlomo Alphabetz, but I bet you sung a song he wrote, a little ditty. If you ever practiced Kabbalah Shabbat, the service on a Friday night, well, not. If you ever sung Lechododi, engaged in Kabbalah, congratulations. The service of Kabbalah Shabbat was invented by the circle of people like Joseph Alphabetz, right, and people like Cordovero and people like Joseph Caro. They invented that entire service. That entire service was invented on a whole cloth by Kabbalists. And Lechododi is the high point of that service. And it's a Kabbalah to the Shabbat as Shekhinah. So, also he developed some of the all-night study sessions that became important development the holiday of Shavuot. He wrote down a tikkun on Shavuot. Stayed up all night. Those kinds of ideas are to Palestine because a spirit, an entity, Joseph Caro, who you probably know more famously as the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the definitive document of Jewish law. Definitive. There is no more important document in Jewish legal history than the Shulchan Aruch. It was produced by Joseph Caro, a Kabbalist of this time period, who saw visions of the Magid, sometimes as the Shekhinah, sometimes as a embodied version or a spiritual version of Mishnah, the rabbinic text. And so much of modern Judaism, whether it's the legal text like Shulchan Aruch, or whether it's ritual stuff like Kabbalat Shabbat, like Echad, or it's other things, formed, fused, hewn in the 60s, in the aftermath of the 1492 disaster of the Alhambra Decree. It's being developed by Kabbalists to popularize ideas from the Sefer Zohar, to basically roll out a red carpet for the coming of the Messiah. They are popularizing these ideas as part of a messianic redemption arc in their mind. So these ideas, which were very closely hidden, are now being published, put out there, rendered out there. Make songs out of it. If you've ever been to a Friday night service in any synagogue ever, you are living in the shape of these people doing Kabbalah in the hopes of using ideas from the Zohar to welcome and herald them. Now, I don't know if you do that or care, but you were. So, Kabbalat Shabbat, Friday night services begin here in Spot, right? At some level, begin here in Spot, and they are imbued deeply. Go read Echad. Go read the English translation for it. It's all about welcoming the bride, getting married to Shabbat in the form of Shekhinah. It's Kabbalistic all day long. The Zohar itself is also now reaching its canonization at some level. It's printed for the first time in Italy at the printing of Cremona. Although that printing is not very widely recognized, it's only ran for a few volumes. But the definitive edition was also printed just around the same time at Mantua, and the Mantua edition became the standard version. The 3-volume version of Mantua became the standard. So the Zohar is now being printed. The printing of the Zohar actually was precipitated at least first by Christians, and then the Mantua edition was going to rapidly assimilate the ideas of Kabbalah all through the world, especially the European one. Cordovero's work is going to be soon surpassed by Isaac Lurie. We'll get to him next time. When is it happening? As we all will. And Luria comes to spot the very rock, and above the funeral train of Cordovero, of the Rama, it's like Luria saw a pillar of fire reaching up into heaven. Now, if you know something about the book of Exodus, the book of Exodus describes God appearing to the Israelites as a pillar of fire. Literally, Isaac Luria says, Cordovero, God is literally going with Cordovero on his funeral train. Itzhak Luria joins the train. Itzhak Luria, Arizal, the lion, comes to Tzfat and spends only a few years in Tzfat. When he dies, he only spends, but the few years that he spends in Tzfat before he dies very young. He's only like 40 when he dies. He spends a few years teaching. And the 3 or 4 years that he spent in Tzfat, or the 2 or 3 years he spent in Tzfat, are going to transform Kabbalah forever. The teachings that he imparts to 2 of his students, one is Chaim Vital, the other is another student called Israel Saru, who's not as well known. But between Saru and Chaim Vital, really more Chaim Vital, Kabbalah is going to become a completely integrated part of Jewish theology and philosophy of Jewish law. Kabbalah, as we know it, is going to basically become Lurianic Kabbalah. The Kabbalah, as we all know it, is going to be the Kabbalah downstream of Itzhak and Chaim Vital's. And what ends up emerging, Chaim Vital's version of the Kabbalah, its very peculiar interpretation, which we'll get to next time, becomes the authentic, definitive, final version of Kabbalah. That's a huge deal. He will set the stage for all further Kabbalistic speculation. Now, what's also important here is that the Christians have taken notice also of Kabbalah. They've also gotten interested in this messianic fervor. And they've also gotten interested in the idea that Jews may have some weird secrets way back in the day. Jews at this point, beginning of the 15th century, especially by the 16th century, are taking intense interest in Kabbalah. And they're going to actually Kabbalah Christianity. In Christian Kabbalah, it's going to be an incredibly important part. It's one of its glorious students who is going to provide the definitive version of Kabbalah Sum, the contraction, Tikkun Olam, the reparation of the world, Shirah, right, the idea of the shattering of the vessels, Klipot, the idea that there are broken vessels and shard vessels. If you've ever heard any of these ideas come from Lurianic Kabbalah. They are versions of Kabbalah developed by based on the Sufism of week. We're going to dive into Lurianic Kabbalah. Lurianic Kabbalah, as I said just a moment ago, it's become the baptized, if you like. It's the definitive, authentic, standard version. There were other versions of Kabbalah that existed prior, but Lurianic Kabbalah become the canonical version of Kabbalah. So notice what's already happened. By the late 16th century, no doubt any more basically about it. The question is, how do we interpret it correctly? The canonical version of Kabbalah. That's a big deal. Because something that is, at this point, 300 years old. 1270s is when it first began to emerge, really. And by 1572, with the death of Isaac Luria, it's going to become definitive. So by the Zohar is scripture. And it's going to affect every version of Jewish life, from the Siddur, prayer book, to liturgy, Kabbalah, to ritual life, putting on tefillin during Chol even Jewish law. It's going to affect all these things. And the Lurianic Kabbalah will be the standard mechanism by which all other forms of Kabbalah will be measured. So we'll come back next week and we'll begin the process of handling the Lurianic Kabbalah. Welcome, thank you for joining me.
So tomorrow,
explore the garden that is Judaism.
when it gets 10, you fight. Go fuck yourself. What? That's that guy.